Welcome to Murder Road Trip. I'm your host, Haley. Joining me on today's road trip is Charlie, the co-host of Insight and host of a new podcast, Impact Statement. Charlie, can you tell us about your podcast?
Absolutely. My first podcast is called Insight. And in Insight, it's my co-host and we just tell a true crime story that we've researched. A lot of times we'll do a story that's lesser known. We tend to lean towards unsolved cases as well. And I have Impact Statement, which is a fairly new one, where I talk to victims and their families. Often in the literature, they're called co-victims. And they get to tell me how this incident, usually a crime, has impacted their life. It's narration with interview clips, and so it's a lot different than Insight.
Both podcasts are so important to the true crime community. You are giving a voice to those who rarely get the opportunity to speak. I recommend that everyone checks out both of your podcasts. Where can listeners find you?
Listeners can find me at Facebook, Insight, or Impact Statement. At Statement Pod is the best way to find me on Twitter. Or you can email me at impactstatementpod@gmail.com.
Well, I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I've been wanting to have you on since the beginning of the show, but you had a baby and
I think I hinted enough, like, so when are you having those co-hosts on again?
Yes, and I felt so bad because I try to schedule pretty far out so I can always have somebody on, and I was like, I guess I'll pencil you in for February.
Well, I appreciate you making sacrifices so I could be here tonight.
You're welcome. We will be snacking on a Missouri invention, 7-Up, and a Kansas classic mashup, cinnamon rolls and chili, as we make our way to both sides of Kansas City to discuss the murders of Sarah DeLeon and Diana Ault. As you know, I typically ask my co-host if they want to pick the topic, but this time I did things a little differently. For the past year and a half, Kansas and Missouri residents have heard a lot about the murders of Sarah and Diana. I knew I wanted to have Charlie on the podcast, like I said before, and I thought she'd be the perfect co-host for this topic because, as most of you know, Charlie lives in Missouri and I live in Kansas. So Charlie, did you know anything about the murders of Sarah and Diana prior to us talking about this episode?
I did not. I read a lot of news and watch a lot of news online, but I realize that leaves a huge gap in local news, which is usually, on the TV that only in my house seems to play Netflix and Moana, like, all the time. So I actually haven't heard about this, which is just surprising because it has been so big in our news locally. And I was actually a little annoyed because after I looked into this, I thought this would be such a great episode for Insight. But now, you called dibs. It's only fair.
Now I feel bad. You totally could have taken it. I remember hearing about just this headline that a decades-old cold case had finally made some progress. But I had never heard of the names of Diana Ault or Sarah DeLeon. And I don't think I even clicked on any of the stories because, like you said, they're local. And a lot of the times, I don't know if you've run across this, but my local news will have like one or two sentences and then they don't really go into any detail. So I think I only read the headlines and I definitely didn't know a lot about it. This story begins on February 13th, 1987, with a woman named Maggie Lovett. It was the day before Valentine's Day and romance was in the air. Maggie had received word that her new boyfriend was throwing a party at a local Kansas City hotel, the American Inn. Her boyfriend had booked a room and even rented a limousine to pick her up. When Maggie got to the hotel room, she didn't find her boyfriend. Instead, she found her boyfriend's ex-girlfriend, Caroline Heckert, and one of Caroline's friends. It had been a ruse. What followed next is unclear, but Maggie believes she was drugged. What police referred to as, quote, abduction by deception, end quote, is just the beginning of a twisted tale of jealousy, cheating, and romantic rivalry. So on that note, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am.
We lost the station again.
trying.
Hold on. Let me try this one.
Stop. That's it. Turn it up. Turn it up.
So in 1989 in Kansas City, Kansas, Sarah DeLeon lived there. We know she lived with her mom, and she had a brother, Matt, who was just a year difference in their age, so they grew up super close. And he said she would go watch his sports practices and things that, I don't know, I had siblings. I felt like we were kind of close, but we didn't really do that sort of thing. Like maybe I would go to their game, but not their practices. But they did a lot of things together. And I also read in an article that she had a sister, but I haven't seen the sister give any interviews. So that's really all I know about that. And at the time she was 19 years old, she had graduated Washington High School in Kansas City, Kansas. And for those who don't know, Kansas City, Kansas is on one side of the state line, on the one side of the river, and on the other side of the river is Kansas City, Missouri. And when you think of Kansas City, the big city with Union Station and Kauffman Stadium and all of that, that's the Missouri Kansas City. Kansas City, Kansas is an urban area, but it's much smaller than Kansas City, Missouri. She was attending the local community college, and we're talking Christmas time, so she would have completed her first semester. And she was hoping to work in the travel industry. Her mom said she was just fascinated by world cultures. She was very health-oriented. She was fun-loving. And her parents said that they worried about the usual things about her dating, growing up, what she would be when she grew up, just that transition into adulthood. But they didn't have to worry about the partying and the drugs and the drinking because that wasn't something she really did.
She sounds like such a great child to her parents, and I love that she was so close to her brother. I also grew up with siblings, and it was not like that.
Yeah, and she got along with most people. Most people didn't have a problem with her. She was a free spirit. She was her own person, but she was very much a leader. People would look to her to almost set trends in the school. But there was one person who didn't like her, and a threat was made against her. And the boyfriend she was dating, and the time frame we're talking about, you know, her first semester at college, his ex-girlfriend asked another friend to get Sarah drunk to cut off her hair, because Sarah had this long, beautiful hair. And this is actually an interesting thing. If there are any history nerds out there, you know, throughout history, cutting off someone's hair, especially a woman's hair, was a way to shame them. So it's interesting in some sense that this girl who probably didn't know that also had that same instinct to shame her, make her ugly by cutting off her hair. Now, this didn't happen. The friend who she was talking to about this, obviously, he was like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the thing about the hair, because I was just about to ask you, what do you think that's all about? I have heard about girls being kind of like catty, and in another episode I've done about Laurie Show in Pennsylvania, that was one thing that her attacker had threatened to do, was to cut off her hair. And I was wondering what that was all about, but you answered that for me. That's pretty serious, though, to cut off a woman's hair.
Right. I mean, I read this and I kind of recoiled at this idea that they would get her drunk to cut off her hair. And I mean, that's because as a woman, I have the same, I don't even wear my hair long, and I still have that same kind of reaction to hair being forcefully cut off.
Yeah, it sounds painful, and it would just be, I mean, my first reaction to the thought of that happening to me is that I would be so devastated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting that throughout history, it has been used as a weapon against women.
As if we didn't have enough against us.
Exactly. So, leading up to what we're talking about, which, of course, is Sarah's murder, She had a Christmas party with her family, and her boyfriend was there, and this was just about 2 days before, so December 26th, 27th, and that would be the last time her family saw her. She went out to dinner with her boyfriend, and they went back to his house. She left in her own car around midnight, and then her car would later be found on an overpass. She had a black Mustang. It was her prized possession, as you can imagine if you were a young college student and had a black Mustang in excellent condition, it would be your prized possession as well. And there were no signs of damage on the vehicle, and that is important later. Now, about 2 miles from where the car was found, a train conductor was coming on the train along the tracks and actually saw the body off the tracks, that it wasn't like laying over the tracks or anything, off the tracks under the highway. And Haley, do you know what his first reaction was?
I do. He thought it was a mannequin.
Haley and I have both been doing true crime podcasts for a while now, and the number of times people have thought they found a mannequin on a beach, in a park, under railroad tracks. Like, it kind of comes up, and it's like the brain just cannot process that there might be a body there. That a mannequin on a beach would make more sense, or a mannequin on the side of the road would make more sense to people. It doesn't when you think about it, but our brains just shut down to protect us, and we don't process what we're seeing. But of course, he came to his senses and realized it was a body, and he called the police. And the body was behind a pillar, like a big support thing, so she couldn't be seen from the road that ran parallel to the tracks, but it could be seen from the tracks, obviously. This area was isolated. It was known by the local kids as a party spot. And I think every town has their party spot that all the kids know to go to. Most of the high school kids would have known this location, so that doesn't really, narrow it down to, even though it was isolated, it wasn't unique information that only one person would have.
Right, and I think that's so interesting because obviously her body was hidden. Like, she wasn't just murdered and left in the same exact spot. I mean, it was specifically placed there so it couldn't be seen from the road, or at least in my opinion. And I think it is also important that it did happen in a place where somebody her age would know of, you know what I mean? Like, that kind of narrows down, at least in my mind, the number of suspects. Like, if it was a random 60-year-old man, would he know about this place?
Right. This definitely would make you think it's someone either in her peer group or just peer as in the same age, but she may not have known them. Although there were 26 stab wounds, and now with stabbings, I don't know how graphic you want me to get, but I'll be pretty basic with it. With stab wounds, it's not like they stab one place, then move to the next and move to the next. So stab wounds, because they can overlap and their edges can be blurred through overlapping, it's really hard to know exactly how many stab wounds there were, but it was estimated to be about 26, which is an extreme number of stab wounds. Really, anything more than a couple is a lot of force and a lot of passion, and you'd have to be up close and personal to have done that to her. So I would definitely lean towards someone who really hated her and had something against her. And like Haley said, with the way the body was hidden, it seems like that was on purpose, and they did find drag marks indicating she was moved, and there was not enough blood on the scene for them to feel that, yes, that's where she was killed. So the theory was she was killed somewhere else and transported to the spot to be hidden.
Right, with 26 stab wounds, there would be a lot of blood.
Right, and it wasn't there. So really, this spot under the highway would be more accurately characterized as a dump site. The initial concern was that it may have been something that was happening around town at the time called a, quote, bump and rob, where basically it would be a fender bender and it would be designed to get the driver out of the car to look at the damage, because that's what we do. But the other person who just rear-ended you would actually jump in your car and take off. Maybe they would hit you or whatever. It was basically a means to carjack someone. But the stabbing, like I said, it seemed personal. It didn't seem like something someone who just wanted to steal a car would have done. And the car was left behind. If you're a carjacker and you don't actually take the car, you've failed. You had one job, and that was to steal a car, and you failed at it. And also, like I said earlier, it was important to remember the car was found without any damage on it.
And it was a Mustang in impeccable condition. So as a car thief, that's like the ultimate car. You're, like you said, you're not going to leave without the car, but you're definitely not going to leave without the Mustang.
Right. And there was not blood in the car or signs that she was, as far as I know, that she was transported in her own car.
So is the theory that somehow the person got her out of her car, transported her in something else, killed her, and then drug her body to the location by the railroad tracks?
Yeah, the theory, I don't know how clearly spelled out it is as far as the sequence of events, but it's, from what it seems to me, from what I've read, is that somehow the person got her to get out of her car and took her in their car, so which would make you think it was someone she knew unless she was taken at like knife point or something. Because her car wasn't left somewhere where you would naturally park a car. It was like on the shoulder. So it's not like she was at somebody's house, but it's also possible that the person then moved her car to make it look like she just, broke down or something. It's kind of hazy to me. I mean, I think there are a couple ways this could work.
It doesn't help that this took place, in the 80s, and their method of police work was so different than now. So we're not going to have the same amount of detail.
Right. And another thing that would be super helpful at this point, whenever you're talking about moving parts like vehicles, is CCTV footage, which the US does not have nearly as much as like they have in the UK or whatever, but we still generally have security cameras somewhere. But again, this is the late 80s, so any security cameras weren't very great. They used tapes that would be taped over because we weren't digital yet. They were really expensive, so most security cameras, quote-unquote cameras you would see in stores in the late 80s, were dummy cameras. It's just a box with a red blinking light. So, we didn't have as much information that we might have had in a more technological age. Her car didn't have GPS. She didn't have a cell phone, that kind of thing.
Right. And was her boyfriend ever a suspect? I mean, he was the last person to supposedly see her alive.
Now, his alibi was that he was home all night, and the person who verifies it is his mom, which, you're always like, of course his mom's going to back up his alibi. But my alibi any night of the week is my husband, because who else is in your house at 2 a.m. except your mom or your husband or whoever you live with? So he really couldn't have had a better alibi because, it was the overnight hours. But there doesn't seem to be anyone who suspects him, and her family definitely does not. They believe him and they believe his mom that he was home at night, and they don't suspect him. They thought he was a nice guy. They weren't having relationship issues. None of the things that you would think would trigger him being a suspect, though, you have to wonder. Obviously, I'm sure they looked into him with some detail.
Right. Hopefully they checked just past him having an alibi.
Right. But again, without cell phones or checking what time he was on the internet or any of that, no digital footprint. It's kind of hard to prove one way or the other. But it doesn't look like he was ever looked at as, a serious suspect, though I guarantee he was looked into.
Yeah, and I don't know how much you put into this, but I watched a short Dateline clip interviewing Sarah's mom. And like you said, she doesn't find the boyfriend to be a suspect. And I sometimes have to wonder if like a mom just knows, you know what I mean? Like she said she just basically does not think that he's a victim. And I wonder if, I don't know if I'm making sense. It's almost like a mother's intuition.
I think she had just seen them 2 days before, saw how he treated her daughter, how they interacted. They had met him a couple of times. So I really don't think you're off track there, that she got, I don't want to say a vibe, but you know what I mean by vibe. She got a feel for their interactions and for their dynamic. And I think there is some weight to that. I know abusive relationships can be hidden and it's hard for people to see them, but it sounds like Sarah was really close to her family and they would have seen if there was something off with that dynamic. I do think they were more likely to see it because of their closeness. And, you know, we talked about the ex-girlfriend. Police did interview her within 2 weeks of the murder, but it obviously didn't go anywhere at the time.
Do you know if she had an alibi?
You know, I could not figure that out in the interviews with one of her friends that came out later. She has a friend who suspects that she did do it. And she just said she went in to get questioned and then she came out happy and just calm and not worried. So she thought that was the end of it. So I don't know what she said to the police, but her friend said she didn't seem concerned. And she did tell her friend she did not do it. Which, I mean, I'm not going to tell you if I did something like that. And I consider you a friend.
Oh, thank you. Before we move on, I just have, just one more comment. I think it is interesting that you brought up that the spot near the railroad tracks was a spot for partiers, but Sarah was not a partier. So, that just kind of adds into the thought that she wasn't there when she was murdered.
Right. And she may have been dumped there to make it look like, it was a party night gone wrong.
Well, they forgot to leave all the blood there, so that didn't add up.
Exactly.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about Diana Marie Ault. She was born on May 17th, 1967. She was an intelligent, degree-holding woman who was working multiple jobs when she was murdered in Independence, Missouri, which, as Charlie so lovingly told me earlier, it is a neighboring city to Kansas City.
Yeah, it is. I would not say Independence is a suburb. It's actually quite a city itself. It's a very urban area.
Yeah, I was just going to call it a suburb, but you're definitely right. I saw that it's like the 5th biggest city in Missouri. So,
I mean, there's not a lot of competition there. Missouri's like 3 big cities and a whole lot of nothing, but it is, it is a bigger size city.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say that not as much is known about Diana Ault as there is about Sarah, so I tried to get as much information as I could, but it seems like she was a great mother, and I know that she was a paralegal and she was working, other jobs in retail. Everyone liked her. She just seemed to be an overall good person. On the 30th of January, 1994, it was Super Bowl Sunday, and 26-year-old Diana and her 2 children, 4-year-old Josh and 6-month-old Katie, attended a Super Bowl party. I'm just going to get this out of the way now. The kids are fine, so don't even worry about that. As the night grew later, Diana decided to leave the party early, so she gathered up her children and headed home, which is totally understandable. You don't want to be out till midnight with your 2 kids. When they arrived home, Diana let Josh and Katie go into the house while she grabbed something out of the car. Diana then entered the dark house and walked through the living room toward the kitchen. As she entered the kitchen, Diana was shot by a person wearing a mask. And police kind of talked about this as she was ambushed. The person had been waiting inside the house and was hiding in the kitchen just waiting for them to get home. The killer then picked Josh up and carried him down the hallway and placed him in his parents' bedroom closet. And the killer left Katie to crawl around the house unattended. So I want to stop right here and just say that I find this really interesting because It seemed as if the way Josh just later described it, that the killer picked him up not in like in a mean way, almost in like a nurturing way, kind of held him like you would hold a baby, and then just proceeded to walk down the hallway into his parents' bedroom. To me, because I am one of those people that maybe jumps to the other end of the spectrum, how did this killer know where his parents' bedroom was? If you're in a home that you don't know, what are the chances that you're just going to find the bedroom? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, it does sound like someone who had been in the house before. It's also interesting when you think about it that Josh was put in the closet but not the baby, and I think it's because Josh would be old enough to remember his mom lying on the kitchen floor dead, and the baby wouldn't. So, because, I mean, if you're protecting anyone, you would protect the baby from, getting hurt or whatever. But I think the person was trying to protect Josh from seeing his mother on the floor, because that's all I could come to. I've been thinking about this for a week and a half now. Why did Josh get put in the closet and not the baby? And that's the only thing I can come to. Because the person carried Josh, like, not hiding anything. Of course, Josh was little and couldn't really remember a lot more than it was just a figure. It was a very stressful moment. But all I can really come up with is that the person was protecting Josh from seeing his mother like that, which is just bizarre.
That's an interesting thing to do to me. It's almost like a loving thing to do. Like I said, the killer didn't, hold him out like, what do I do with this thing? The killer like held him close, and calmly walked him to the bedroom. And like you said, they were trying to protect him. And to me, that's interesting because I feel like if this was a random murder or later on they're going to suspect it's a burglary gone wrong, I don't think a burglar in the heat of the moment is going to take the time to carefully carry a 4-year-old to a bedroom closet.
No, there's very much about this crime seems very planned. I wonder if the killer didn't expect her to come home with the children, thought she was going to be coming home alone, and that was unexpected. But I feel like the details of this murder were planned, that they laid in wait for her in order to kill her.
Oh, of course. Especially since the house was dark when they came in. If you're burglarizing a home, you're going to turn the lights on, right? You're not going to be able to find stuff in the dark.
Right.
You don't have flashlights on your phones then. They didn't even have, they just had the brick phones. So after the killer took Josh into the bedroom closet, they grabbed the gun that they had used to kill Diana, and then they got into Diana's vehicle and drove approximately a mile to a nearby church. And they left the vehicle running and kept the gun inside of the vehicle. Josh eventually summoned the courage to leave the closet. That's kind of how he described it. He was just waiting until he felt brave enough to leave the closet. And he went to go take care of his baby sister, who he said was just kind of crawling around near his mom's body. Josh attempted to call 911, but he was unsuccessful. Being 4, probably not using the phone a lot, I can imagine that he didn't know how to use it.
Yeah, I don't think my 4-year-old would know how to call 911.
Since he couldn't call 911, he decided to make his sister Katie a bottle and waited on the floor next to his mother. I thought that was so sweet.
It was, and his sister, I saw an interview where she's the one who told this story, and I have a lot of kids. It kind of got to me.
Oh, I bet. It's so amazing that this 4-year-old would have that instinct.
Yeah, because my younger kids are these ages. They're, 4 and 5 months. So it's kind of, it's a sweet, it's a very sad story, but it's a sweet moment within the sad story that, she had a brother to take care of her.
At around midnight, approximately 3 hours later, police ran across the abandoned running vehicle in the church parking lot. Police ran the plates and identified the vehicle as Diana Ault's. After they acquired her address, they headed over to Diana's residence. When police entered the Ault house, they found Katie and Josh sitting next to their mother, which had to be like the saddest sight you've ever seen.
The things police officers see, just the physical horror, but these emotional moments, I don't know how they can do their job. I could never do it.
Me either. So later on, during his police interview, Diane's husband, Tim, told police that he had been working the night shift at the post office when the murder occurred. So that's a pretty solid alibi. You got time cards and things. Tim also said that his marriage to Diana was great. There had been no issues. And when he was asked, he told police that there was no one he could think of that would want to harm Diana. Based on the information given by Tim, police figured that the murder was due to a robbery gone wrong. The house was empty. They were at a Super Bowl party. The person was about to rob the house. They enter the house, kill the adult, and leave. But that theory just didn't fit. There was only one thing missing from the house, a .44 Magnum revolver, the same one that was found in the running vehicle. So it was determined that the killer had used Tim's gun that was inside the house to kill Diana. So to me, I grew up in a house with guns from Kansas, so I feel like that's a duh. We had guns around, but my dad had them in spots where we couldn't just easily get to them, because if I'm a 4-year-old, I don't quite understand, So I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it seems like Tim would keep the gun somewhere that wasn't just out and about. So how did the killer know where the gun was?
I agree with that. I also grew up in a household with guns, and I grew up in the 1980s, and guns were not left laying around. So by 1994, I know some people are careless with their guns, but how would someone know where the gun was? But how would someone even know a gun was in the house ahead of time? Why didn't they bring their own weapon? And the only answer I have to that is that they knew they could find something in there.
I 100% agree with that. And also I feel like if it's a burglary gone wrong, then you're either going to have a gun with you, or you're not going to be able to just magically find that gun and kill the person that's coming in on you. Like, there's no chance.
Right, and then leave the gun and the car behind, so you walked away with absolutely nothing after you killed someone with this magical gun that just showed up out of nowhere. Yeah, none of it makes sense. Not when the weapon came from inside the house.
Because this theory of burglary gone wrong didn't add up, police decided to talk to Diana's sister, Sharon, for more information. Their talk with Diana yielded completely different answers than their talk with Tim. Sharon told police that Tim had been having an affair with a coworker at the post office. Why does this always happen?
This is a common between finding mannequins instead of, thinking bodies are mannequins, and there always being some story being hidden. We hear this a lot.
And it just so happened that on Christmas Eve, just a month prior to the murder, Tim left the family to go live with his mistress. And a week before the murder, Tim left his mistress and moved back into the family home. So he ended things, or supposedly ended things. After he moved back in, Diana started receiving threatening phone calls from a woman, presumably the mistress. The phone calls said things around the lines of, "You're going to be out of the picture, and I'm going to be the woman who raises your kids." Now, to me, this sort of leads, I don't know if I'm reaching here, but if the murderer was the mistress, then of course she's going to carefully take care of Josh, because she's going to presumably be raising him, right?
Right. That she is, if she killed Diana to get her out of the way so that she could move into that role, she would be protecting and caring for the children.
Yes.
She would be already seeing Josh and the baby as hers.
Exactly. At one point, the woman who was making these threatening phone calls even broke into the home and wrote a sinister message on Diana's bathroom mirror with lipstick. So another thing, the mistress had already been inside of the home, which means she might know where the gun is. And she would know where the bedroom is.
Right.
Diana was terrified, so she changed the locks and her phone number, and then she even filed a harassment report with the Independence Police Department, which is great. You should always do that. After hearing these details, police checked into the harassment report. Diana had indeed filed a report describing the same incidences that Sharon had told them about. Police then followed up with Tim and asked him about his mistress. He came clean and told them the name, Carolyn Heckert, and police went to talk to her. During her interview with police, Caroline told police that on the night of the murder, she had been at a Super Bowl party in Manhattan, Kansas, which is about 100 miles away. After talking to Caroline, police were at a loss of where to go next. They were out of suspects. So that's one thing I definitely have questions about. I want to know more about this Super Bowl party. Did they look into that? Was it just a party with one person, like she went to go visit a friend, or was there a group of people that could place her at this party?
Yeah, I have not seen anything on that, on the investigation into her alibi.
Seems like a lot of that.
Yeah.
So Josh and Katie went to live with their grandparents, and as time passed, the murder of Diana Ault was put on the back burner and then eventually closed. Let's go ahead and fast forward to the 2010s. Jeff Cheek, who responded to the location where Sarah DeLeon's body was found, was unsatisfied with the outcome of Sarah's case. And I read that even when he was still on the force, he would contact the detectives that were on her case and he would ask for updates. And he was also the same age as her, I believe. And so he was able to tell police, as Charlie said, that the area by the railroad tracks was a party area. So he was a good informant for them. Jeff contacted Sarah's family and asked if he could work on the case as a private investigator because at this time he was no longer on the force. Jeff started interviewing witnesses, including a woman who grew up with Sarah. And this is the same friend that Charlie described earlier. Her name was Jamie Locke, and she was friends with Caroline. For years, Jamie had suspicions that Sarah and Diana's cases were related due to information she heard from Caroline herself. She finally came clean about her suspicions when she talked to Jeff Cheek. At the same time as he was conducting interviews, Jeff also started researching new DNA technology. While researching, Jeff found that Sarah's clothes could be retested with today's new technology. In 2014, he took the information he gathered from witnesses and research to the police, and I think I read he had like a 70-page report to give them, which is great. Finally, Sarah DeLeon's case was reopened in July of 2014, but shockingly, Diana Ault's case was not. And this could be because of the different jurisdictions. Sarah's case happened in Kansas City, Kansas, and Diana's case happened in the Missouri side.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this Caroline Heckert. She was born Caroline Kuhn, and she went to school in KCK. When she finished college, she got married, she had kids. She was known as a dedicated mom, and she was working as a real estate agent. In 2014, she was a 48-year-old PTA mom living in Smithville, Missouri, which is about half an hour north of Kansas City, Kansas. When she was back in high school, she did have a reputation for being vindictive with romantic rivals. So there was this woman named Erin who had dated a boy that Caroline had dated before, and the boy actually dumped her to date Erin. So what did Caroline do? She covered Erin's car with fish guts. And the friend who suspected her in both Diana and Sarah's murders said that another time she had let the air out of another girl's tires.
This is stuff out of the movies.
It is. It seems odd that she would have done so many of these things and not seem to have gotten in any legal trouble from them.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just a different time or if they just kind of saw it as petty nonsense. But a lot of the times this petty nonsense grows into things that are not just petty anymore.
Right. And, it seems like a lot of bullying type stuff. And I'm trying to think back in high school. And I guess if This sort of stuff happened. The sort of stuff, I mean, you could put air back in your tires, you can wash off fish guts. The stuff that's not super destructive, maybe we wouldn't have reported it. I mean, she wasn't keying cars or painting, graffiti messages or anything. So maybe it seemed just, I don't know, vindictive, but fairly benign at the time. Of course, we're looking back on it now where we're getting more to, this zero tolerance policy on bullying and harassment. We're talking the 1980s. Maybe it was different. There was romantic rivalry between Caroline and Sarah, and this friend Jamie who came forward. Another thing that made her suspicious was that Caroline was messy. Like, her car was always a mess, which I can personally identify with. But shortly after, right after Sarah's murder, Jamie got in her car and noticed it was completely clean. Like, not just the trash picked up, but it was cleaned. And that Caroline had a scratch on her neck. She claimed it was from her cat.
Could be coincidence, but really, what? The cat scratch, I could write that off. But this, cleaning your car, I also can identify with having a messy car. And I'll tell you this, I've never had my car professionally cleaned.
Right. And we have to remember it was, December 29th, so it would have been freezing cold, because that's just how it is here. She wasn't standing outside cleaning out her car. Or, you tend to just do that on a warm thaw day. And from what I read, it was cold for several days after the murder.
And it's right around the holidays. It's in that awkward time between Christmas and New Year's Day. And it's just very suspicious.
Right. And so then in May of 2016, the Kansas City, Kansas police held a press conference. They announced that they had a suspect in Sarah's murder, and they came out and said that they thought it was possibly linked to the murder of Diana Ault. They didn't play around with that. They said they believed they were linked. They didn't give a name, but they mentioned the motive was this romantic rivalry. And then in October of the same year, they announced that they had arrested Caroline Eckhart for first-degree murder in the case of Sarah DeLeon. These charges were only for Sarah and not Diana's. The murders happened probably about 15 miles apart, but we're talking two different states, like Haley said. So we're talking two different jurisdictions. It's guaranteed that the Independence Police were watching what was unfolding in KCK very closely. The state did not give any information as to why they were arresting her then. What was linking Caroline to the murder after all this time? And that makes sense because they were looking to go to trial, and you don't reveal anything you don't have to before trial. But Caroline's attorney has claimed they had nothing. They didn't have any direct evidence. They just had these stories. They didn't have forensics linking his client, and they found foreign DNA on Sarah that did not match his client, and they didn't find any that did. So initially, Caroline was given a $1 million bond, which is, fairly normal for a first-degree murder, but her attorney argued 3 months after arrest, she was still locked up, to have it lowered to $100,000. His justification was that the state's case was weak, it was all circumstantial, and that his client wasn't a flight risk. She knew she was considered a suspect before her arrest, but she didn't leave. She stayed in the area. Now, of course, the state objected to this. They noted the brutal nature of the crime and also Caroline's history of harassing people. And some of the potential witnesses for the state were afraid of her. Now, I will say here, I've not seen anything since her high school, late teens, early 20s. I guess maybe into her 20s with Diana Ault, some ongoing pattern of harassing people. There hasn't been any recent history that I found. I don't know if you found any.
I didn't know.
So, I don't want to hold somebody to something that they did when they were young and immature if they're not, still currently doing that behavior. But we don't know. I mean, it's possible. Anyway, that's a side note. The judge more or less split the difference between the sides, and he reduced the bond to $500,000 with the condition that she be on house arrest if she did get out, and she could not have any contact with witnesses. Again, very standard conditions. But even with this reduction, she had to come up with 10%, which is $50,000 in cash, and then have some type of collateral for the remaining amount for the bondsman. Now, let's talk geography for a minute. We don't live on the east or the west coast. Haley and I both enjoy the lower cost of living out here. So we're talking Smithville, Missouri, population 8,000. You can get today a nice 4-bedroom house, brand new construction in Smithville for $300,000. So it's very unlikely, even though it's been reported she had a very nice house in Smithville. I mean, it's unlikely she had enough equity in her home to put up for the collateral. So the reduction didn't do her much good because she still couldn't make bail.
Wow. I'm glad you provided all that information because honestly, I had no idea about any of that. You're a good partner.
I am nothing if not thorough.
So because she couldn't make bail, like Charlie said, Caroline had to stay in jail until she had her preliminary hearing, which was about 6 months after her arrest. Honestly, that's a pretty long time to be in jail for, I would call her a pampered woman. One day would be a lot for me. I can't even imagine 6 months.
If we actually wanted to make this podcast 3 hours long, just get me started on pre-trial detention, and I could go on about this for hours. But if you think about, just imagine you didn't do a crime and you get arrested and you sit in jail for 6 months. How did you pay your mortgage? How did you buy food for your kids? Who drove your kids to school? How did you keep your job? Just process those things and we'll skip the 3-hour dissertation I have prepared.
Yeah, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. So, after the preliminary hearing, the first-degree murder charges against Caroline Hecker were dropped on April 7th, 2017. Wyandotte County Judge Aaron Roberts dismissed the charges because he did not believe prosecutors presented enough evidence to find Caroline guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. During the hearing, the prosecution suggested that the scratch on Caroline's neck that Charlie discussed earlier was from a cat fight. So they were suggesting that Caroline and Sarah had gotten into a cat fight prior to her murder. Judge Roberts stated otherwise. He stated that a cat fight would have more than one scratch. Plus, Sarah did not have any scratch marks on her body, only the stab wounds. In defense, the Justice for Sarah Facebook page stated that the women might not have had scratches because of the heavy coats they were wearing due to the cold December temperatures. Just imagine they were wearing probably puff coats, gloves. The chances of a scratch could be pretty low.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it could be very low. I thought it was... I'll give you my thoughts on the judge in a minute. I'll let you finish.
The prosecution also suggested that Caroline dragged Sarah's body to the railroad tracks. As we discussed before, it's highly unlikely that she was not murdered next to the tracks. The prosecution even had at least one person testify that Caroline had a high level of strength that she had clearly demonstrated in previous fights with women. But Judge Roberts stated that he did not believe Caroline could drag Sarah's 120-pound body to the railroad tracks. In conclusion, Judge Roberts believed there was a lot of motive, he gave the prosecution that, but no physical evidence or witnesses to corroborate the prosecution's theory. So what are your thoughts on the judge? I would love to hear them.
This is such an odd move for a judge. Judges rarely do this, and it really is only if they don't see there being enough evidence. They much rather it go to a jury. So this was odd that he did this. I feel for the family because I am sure they were blindsided by this happening. They probably didn't think it was a possibility. But the prosecution probably didn't think it was much of a possibility. Like you said, the heavy coats, I can see there not being marks on both of their bodies. Also, Sarah was stabbed all over. We can't really say she didn't have any other marks that were hidden by stab wounds. But the idea that a woman couldn't drag a 120-pound body, okay, so a dead body is going to be dead weight, and that would be heavy to carry, but dragging 120, I'm not a strong woman, and I'm not a tall woman. I think I could drag a 120-pound body. Like, I haven't tried it, but dragging isn't, I drag stuff around my house all the time because I can't lift it. So I'm really confused on why he didn't think Caroline could do this unless he had some type of expert witness or so. Just using his own judgment in this doesn't make sense to me. But, you know, it is what it is. And he did dismiss this in a way that they can bring charges again. This will not rise to double jeopardy. So that's something.
Yeah, and more to your point about the dragging the body thing, I thought that was ridiculous as well. And the Facebook page said that the cat fight remarks and this dragging the body was basically sexist of him to just believe that women get in cat fights and there's lots of scratches, and also this woman couldn't possibly drag a 120-pound body. But the thing that interested me the most in the prosecution's theory, and I believe I read this on the Facebook page, just want to give proper credit, was that the ground was frozen. So their theory is that it would be easier to drag a body down, you know, because it would kind of help, you know, if it was slick, it would help.
Right.
So, and like you said, dragging is different than carrying. Yes, I would find it more unbelievable that Caroline, like, threw Sarah's body over her shoulder and just, like, jauntily walked down to the railroad tracks. That is different than dragging.
Yeah, I don't understand where, I think the judge's reasoning, if he didn't feel there was enough evidence, okay, but that he thinks this evidence somehow contradicts the state's theory is ridiculous to me, because there is no evidence that Caroline couldn't have dragged her, and there's no evidence that women who fight leave lots of scratch marks.
Yeah, it's like he just put his own opinion in this.
Yes, I feel like he based his ruling on his preconceived notions and opinions and not on actual facts. So I do find that odd. And I'd be able to stomach it better if he just said, you know, yeah, I hear your witnesses, but that's not enough. Like, I get that. I get that the witnesses might not be enough, but that what he based it on doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, and I think the thing without the reasonable doubt, I kind of tried to put myself as a jury member, kind of hearing all of this evidence. And to me, I have a friend that's a prosecutor, and I talked to her about this, and not about this case specifically, but in the past I've told her, I'm the type of person where I want to have evidence. I want to have hard evidence because I believe a lot in our DNA technology and things, and I would rather hear that than just stories, you know, blah, blah, blah. But on the flip, and she told me she'd never want me on a jury, but on the flip side, this to me seems like there is enough to at least take it to trial. What are the instances? We know that she has dated 3 men who went on to date other women that have all been attacked. What are the chances?
The interesting thing, though, is that the other instances, if she's not prosecuted for them or they're not presented in court, likely aren't in front of the jury. So Diana Ault's murder would not make it in front of Sarah DeLeon's jury. So you can't weigh that. Like, we can weigh that sitting here now, but in a court, that would never have made it in.
Oh, that's so true. We're only supposed to hear about Sarah. Now, my question, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but let's say that charges are brought up again in the future. Caroline is found guilty of Sarah's murder. Could prosecutors bring up Sarah's murder in the trial for Diana's murder?
That would be up to the judge, but they have a good chance because they're related. You can't bring in unrelated bad acts, even convictions. So, you know, if someone's on trial for, you know, sexual assault, you can't bring in that they robbed a store 10 years before. But these are murders of romantic rivals that they can link her to. You know, I think there'd be a good argument to bring it in as a related case.
That makes perfect sense. I can see both sides now that you brought that up, but still, like you said, it's so unheard of that the judge would just make his own opinion rather than. I'm just flabbergasted by that.
Right. Yeah, that really surprised me when I read his statements. So the next step is, what are they doing now that the charges have been dropped? I mean, they dropped the charges on the number one suspect in the case, and as far as I'm concerned, from what I have heard, she is the only suspect, which is why they brought charges. You have to hope that they're testing more evidence, interviewing more witnesses. Sarah's family has a private investigator that they want to have access to the case file, and they've put in a request through the Kansas Open Records Act, but it's been denied. According to the Justice for Sarah Facebook page, this request was denied that he could sit down with the whole file, but what the police did was they put some redacted documents onto a disk and sent her mother a bill for $721. So here's a little behind the scenes in podcasting. This is an unexpected expense of true crime podcasting if you do go this route, and that's the cost of records requests. Even though we have open records and Freedom of Information Act and all of that, they can still charge you, quote unquote, a reasonable amount for the records. So when I write my records requests, I cap how much I'll pay. It says notify me in advance if the cost will be over $100. But it's very likely they didn't put that in there because they never asked for this. They asked to be allowed to sit down with the entire case file and let their PI just walk through the whole of the case. Now, requests on open cases are often denied in full or in part, like this one was. But, I mean, this is a decades-old case. You have to wonder, what would it really hurt to let the family's private investigator be a cold case investigator for a day or a couple of days and sit down and look through the case file, even at the police, like not take it home, but just sit there in a room at the police department and be allowed to look through it to see if there's anything that they might want to look at differently or look at again. That's what cold case investigators do. That's what people at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children do. They'll get a case file that's been investigated and look through it for possible things that may have been missed or for input on where else the police could look or what else they could do. So I don't see what it would hurt. I mean, I understand if they don't want information to get out that will compromise the investigation, but I don't know. I think maybe we're at the point where that shouldn't be their primary concern. And it is absolutely clear from internet postings that both Sarah and Diana's families, they do not believe the police are doing enough since the charges were dismissed to move these cases forward.
Yeah, I read the same thing, and I read that the private investigator just has to hound the police to do anything. And Sarah's mom was talking in a clip I watched that she has learned that she just has to keep bothering them. And to me, that is sad. To me, you shouldn't have to do that. I understand there's a difference between reality and what, you should have to do, but that just makes me sad that you would have to keep bothering the police to solve a case or to at least work on the case. And like you said, what's the harm in letting the private investigator sit down with the case? What's the harm in getting another pair of eyes in there?
Yeah, sometimes, I'm not saying this is the case in this instance, but there are cases where the police, there's one I'm thinking of, but I won't say it because they might not appreciate it, but where the police made some pretty big missteps, and they very likely don't want anyone to see that. You don't, even if you didn't make missteps on purpose, nobody likes to have, the Monday morning quarterback looking over and telling you what you should or shouldn't have done. So I understand some reluctance in that regard, some reluctance. The family does do media interviews, so maybe there's reluctance in letting them have information that maybe the police are trying to keep close to the vest, but it just does not make sense to me that they fulfilled the records request not in the way that was requested, but then still sent the bill. That I don't get.
And I also don't quite understand why you would charge a family member. Like, don't you kind of feel entitled to get that information? It's about your family member.
Yes, and I know that there's been a conversation recently among true crime podcasters. It may have been on Twitter. I can't always remember details, but it was about these open records requests and how much they cost, and that the cost can be prohibitive to families or to startup journalists or to independent podcasters like us to get that information. So that information really is only free if you can afford to pay for it. I will say Wood County, Texas, thank you very much, because they sent me a partially redacted case file for free. They didn't charge me anything. So appreciate them a lot. They really helped me out. That's there.
Great.
But for the most part, you're going to get a bill. And even I was surprised at how high this bill was, because this was put on a disc. So that significantly lowers the price of printing it out and that kind of thing. And the $721 was the reduced price, because you can also say you qualify for a reduced price, and they gave her the reduced price. So, I don't know, that doesn't sit right with me. I don't know. And of course, we're only getting the one side of it because, the police are also bound by not giving all this information out. So we only know this story from Sarah's family side of it. But it does sound like, I don't know, they could handle this request for the records differently than they've chosen to. Not Sarah's family, the police.
Yeah, definitely. So I know I've made my theory sort of obvious as we've gone through. I've been kind of open about that. Maybe I should be a little less open about it. But do you think that the police's theory of romantic rivalry is correct, or at least on some sort of correct path?
I think because they had both women experiencing the same harassment from the same person prior to their deaths, this should be like the primary lead. I think they're correct in bringing charges. Because the state didn't have a chance to present their case, we don't know what all was in there. And we just know her defense attorney says there was no DNA matching her. But we don't know, maybe it did match somebody and we just don't know that. We don't know. So I think they're on the right path. I would like to see the whole of the evidence before I say whether or not they're 100% right.
I could agree with that. I think that, like you said, if she is the primary suspect, they could definitely follow that path and they could go and try to corroborate her alibis more. I mean, there's some simple steps that could easily rule her out. If she truly was at that Manhattan Super Bowl party at the time of the murder, then obviously she wasn't the physical murderer. She still could be a conspirator or anything like that. But I mean, there are things that could easily be done. And like you said, we haven't heard the prosecution side. So maybe that has been done. But it would be interesting to know more about what they've done to try to follow this lead.
Right. And, we also want to hope that they're not getting tunnel vision on this lead, that maybe there is something more to it. Maybe, like you said, she wasn't the one who carried it out. Because if you remember her plan on having the haircut, to have Sarah's haircut, she was trying to get someone else to do it. So, I mean, is it possible that there was a co-conspirator in this? Was it possible that maybe she didn't know it was going to happen, but knows who did do it, and that person did it for her? I mean, I think there are things that could be happening that don't necessarily point directly to Caroline, but, we don't know until they present more of the case, and the family doesn't know because they can't see what they have.
Which I just find ridiculous, as I said before, but Well, thank you so much for coming along for the ride, Charlie.
Well, thank you for inviting me, finally.
I will definitely have to have you back when you're allowed to pick your own topic.
Yes, that sounds good.
And I don't pick it for you. Until next time, please remember to check your back seats, and I'll see you at the next rest stop. If you didn't know already, you can also listen to me on the We're All Just Pretending podcast, where I give bad advice on purpose. You can also find Jess and me on the Playlist podcast. Playlist is a podcast where Josh Hallmark of Our Americana and the Karen and Ellen Letters has different podcasters on to talk about their favorite songs. Every episode has a different theme and a new panel of podcasters. You can find Murder Road Trip at murderroadtrip.com, on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Trip, and on Facebook at Murder Road Trip Podcast. If you're interested in continuing the discussion, you can join the Murder Road Trip podcast group on Facebook. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast app of choice. Please stay tuned after the music to hear from some other great podcasts.
In court cases that end in a conviction, victims and their families are often allowed to make an impact statement, a statement of record of what they had before the crime and what they were left with after. But for unsolved crimes, crimes that don't end in a conviction, or serious life-altering events that aren't crimes at all, there is nowhere for the victims or their families to speak. Impact Statement is a new podcast that talks to victims and their families about life before, during, and after a life-changing event. Impact Statement combines compelling narration with interview clips to give a clear retelling while allowing those who have been affected the most to speak. Impact Statement can be found in Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Insight is a podcast that explores true crime and mysteries.
With two hosts from two continents.
We recommend trying some of our recent episodes like Marcia, Sylvia, and Stonewall that explores gay rights movement in the U.S. and the unsolved death of activist Marsha P. Johnson.
Or our episode on Jaden Lesky, an Australian child whose murder seemed to have been solved. Or perhaps the Lyon sisters, two missing American children who have seen justice. But was it complete justice?
We also covered the Parker Hume case out of New Zealand, a story of teen girls who did the unimaginable, yet went on to live their lives out from the shadow of their crime. That is until the press discovered one of them became a famous author under her new name.
We release episodes every Monday and Thursday. You can find Insight in your favourite podcast app or all across social media just by searching for Insight Podcast.